In this video, we're going to cover Atari 5200 emulation on the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. The Atari 5200, my large 8-bit computer-inspired monster. It is so hard to play your games today on a real TV, so I'm so glad that we can emulate most of your stuff relatively easily on a variety of systems, including the Xbox Series X and S, which is what this video is about. So let's dive in. Now, the first thing we need to do to get Atari 5200 games up and running on the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch is to install the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. A link will be in the description that will take you to my How to Install Retroarch guide, if you haven't done it already. As always, pay close attention to the expanding dev mode storage section and the advanced section here at the end about accessing your Xbox's internal SSD and making a network share. We will be using that in this video. Next, we're going to need to source an Atari 5200 BIOS file and some Atari 5200 games. Over on my channel, I do have a video showing you how to get an Atari 5200 BIOS and a selection of games from the Atari Vault compilation on Steam, so link will be in the description below to this video guide showing you how to legally obtain those. Or, alternatively, you can resort to the shady part of the net and do it that way. I really don't give a crap which way you decide to do it, but don't ask me for illegal download links because none will be provided. But once you have your Atari 5200 BIOS file, make sure it is named 5200.rom. And then from here, we just need to get it added into our Retroarch system folder. So again, follow that advanced setup section in my original Retroarch setup video to access your Xbox's internal SSD. And if you made the network file share, it's as easy as just going right on in, Windows Apps, Retroarch folder, System folder, dump my 5200.rom file right on in. And next we need to decide if we want to store our Atari 5200 games on the internal SSD or on USB. If you want them on the internal SSD, just go up from your System folder to your Made Games folder and drag them right on in. But for my purposes, I use USB because these games are tiny and they load fast anyway. So, just drag them. I don't need the BIOS file. Stop that. I'm just going to drag them right on in. And there we go. Once you have your games stored where you want them and that Atari 5200 BIOS file placed in your System folder, you can go ahead and close out of everything on your computer, take the USB drive out, put it in your Xbox, and switch on over to it. And over on the Xbox, after you have your USB drive in place, if you're using one, just go ahead and get booted into Retroarch. And after Retroarch has finished booting up, there is a little bit more setup required to get Atari 5200 games up and running. So to make this process a little bit easier on myself, I'm actually going to create an Atari 5200 games playlist first. And to do this, I'm going to go to Import Content, and I'm going to do a manual scan. And for my content directory, I'm going to go to my USB drive, my Atari 5200 games folder, and tell it to scan this directory. If you have your games on the internal SSD, you're going to go down to the S drive, Program Files, Windows Apps, Retroarch folder, your Made Games folder, find your Atari 5200 games folder and tell it to scan that directory. Next up, system name, scroll down to Atari 5200. Default core, scroll down until you get to Atari and find Atari 5200, Atari 800. Next, make sure scan recursively is set to on if your games are separated into subfolders, and if you have your game zip, make sure scan inside archives is turned on. But once these options are set, go ahead and start the scan. And once it's finished, we have a new Atari 5200 playlist here on the left. Now, let's talk about getting these games up and running. So go ahead and select any of your Atari 5200 games and tell them to run. And they may load to a black screen just like this. That is perfectly fine. Go into your Retroarch quick menu, and from here scroll down to Options. Now, we're going to change the Atari system from an Atari 400-800 OSB to an Atari 5200. And next, we're going to scroll down to Auto Detect a 5200 cart type and turn this on. And once these options are set, go ahead and back out, close out of your game, and then run it again. And this time, you should boot up into your Atari 5200 game as intended. And now let's talk about controlling Atari 5200 games real quick here. Going back into our Retroarch quick menu, we're going to scroll down to Controls, go to Port 1 Controls, and our device type is set to a RetroPad. That doesn't work under Atari 5200 emulation, so press A on this, and change it to an Atari joystick. And once that's set, you can go ahead and resume your content and actually begin playing your games. Another thing I forgot to mention about controls when you're in the quick menu. After you set your device type to an Atari joystick, make sure that you save this as a core remap file, so that way all of your Atari 5200 games will be set to the Atari joystick, so you don't have to set this manually per game. But another thing I wanted to show off here with Centipede is the fact that controls on certain Atari 5200 games are super sensitive. And that's just due to the way that these games controlled. They relied on a trackball, and that being emulated to a D-pad doesn't transition well. On the standalone version of Atari 800 on PC, you can actually control this with the mouse. You're actually supposed to be able to do that on PC Retroarch as well. I just haven't ever gotten it to work personally. But on the Xbox Series X and S, there is currently no mouse support, so even if it was working as intended, we couldn't take advantage of it right now. So games like Centipede, Star Wars Arcade, you're going to have to really deal with some sensitivity issues. It's not completely unplayable, but it is definitely more difficult than it should be. So just be aware of that as you start tackling into some of your Atari 5200 content. And that's going to do it as far as basic Atari 5200 emulation is concerned. A little bit more involved for getting this one set up compared to some of the other Atari cores, just because we need that BIOS file, and the controls just need a little bit of fine-tuning. But let's now go ahead and talk about some of the more advanced core options available within the Atari 800 core. Not a whole lot here, so it shouldn't take too long. But going back into our quick menu, go down to Options, and we already covered Atari systems, so let's move on to Video Standard. This lets you choose between NTSC or PAL region, so set that here depending on which game type you are playing. We could go ahead and skip over the next couple of options because they're for Atari 8-bit computers, and move on to high-res artifacting. This is a fun option. It basically mimics some of the noise you would find in a CRT. So as you can see, like, there's some color banding, color blending, and it's just really interesting look. Gives it a more authentic feel. And my controller just disconnected, so that was fun. Alright, back into the quick menu. Alright, so personal preference if you want to have this on or off. I like to leave it on for authenticity. Auto detect Atari 5200 cart type, make sure that is turned on or your games might not work. Next, Joy Hack for Atari 5200 Robotron, so if you play Robotron, turn this one on. If you don't, you can leave it off. And finally, we have internal resolution. Do not mess with this. If you change this to any other option, it will break the output until you return it to its proper 240. And then Retroarch keyboard type. Again, not necessary for Atari 5200. But that does it as far as core options are concerned. If there are certain options you want to have set for some games, like the Atari 5200 Robotron hack, go up to Manage Core Options and save that as a game option file, so that way those options greet you when you load up that game, but not other Atari 5200 games. Now, just a quick note about Atari 5200 setup. If you didn't do it in the order that I showed here, where you place the BIOS first before trying to run an Atari 5200 file, you might not be able to get it to load up, even after placing the BIOS file. And if that's the case, go ahead and go into your development files folder and find your Retroarch folder, and find your config folder. I hope that you have set a config folder to be accessible through your S drive. And you'll just want to delete the Atari 800 config files, so that way it resets everything. And you'll also want to delete the Atari 800.config file as well that shows up here. But that should hopefully get you back up and running and able to play your Atari 5200 content. And that's going to do it as far as Atari 5200 emulation is concerned on the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. As always, if you happen to have any questions, feel free to ask me down in the comment section below, and I will do my best to try to help you out. Atari 5200 setup can be a bit interesting, but if you follow it the way I've outlined in this video, should load up just as it did here. But now if you could all do me a huge favor, and please be sure to hit that like or dislike button, just depending on how much you like today's tutorial. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit that sub button so you can see when new videos just like this go live on the channel. Goes a long way to helping us keep the place going, and we're just so grateful to all of you for that. If you'd like to further help support the channel, you can also check out that join button here on YouTube or the Patreon link in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. Little goes a long way to keeping this place going, and we're just so grateful to all of our current backers who have just believed in what we do and show us so much support month after month. Y'all are amazing rock stars and champions. We thank you. But that's going to do it for this one, so until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, you all stay awesome, and we will see you back next video.